I gave my daughter's husband the keys to my company. I told him the cancer had spread to my liver and I had maybe 4 months left. I watched his face carefully, waiting for grief. Instead, his eyes flickered with something else entirely, something bright and hungry and alive. He set down his coffee cup very slowly and said, "Well, we should talk about the transition plan. Not, 'I'm so sorry, Walter.' Not, 'Are you sure? Is there a second opinion?' Just the transition plan." What Roger didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have imagined, was that I didn't have cancer at all. My last scan had come back completely clean. The whole diagnosis was a test, a cruel and necessary test, to see whether the man who married my only daughter actually loved this family or just loved what this family was worth. And the next afternoon, I found out exactly how badly I'd failed to raise her to see him clearly. I was in my workshop out behind the house, and I heard him on the phone through the open window, talking to someone about liquidating the old man's remaining shares before I'd even had the chance to update my will. But here's the part that will genuinely shock you. The person he was talking to about buying out my company, the silent partner he thought was some random investor, was me. My name is Walter Kowalski. I'm 68 years old, and I live outside Bozeman, Montana, on 40 acres I bought back when land here was still cheap and nobody wanted it. I built a precision machine tool company from a 2-car garage into something that supplies parts to 3 different aerospace contractors. I didn't go to college. I learned to weld in the Army and taught myself the rest, one broken part and one sleepless night at a time. When my wife Diane passed 4 years ago, breast cancer, the real kind, the kind that doesn't lie, I threw myself into the business because the house got too quiet to bear. We had one child, our daughter Emily. She's 31 now, married to a man named Roger for about 6 years. Roger sells commercial insurance, or says he does, though I've never once seen him at an actual desk on a weekday. They live in a house I helped them buy the down payment for, drive cars I helped them lease, and take vacations that Emily posts about constantly. Vacations that don't line up with what an insurance salesman with middling commissions should be able to afford. For years, I was the family's quiet backstop. When Roger's investment opportunity in a friend's restaurant went under, I covered it so Emily wouldn't have to know how close they'd come to losing their house. When they overextended on a kitchen renovation, I paid the difference and told myself it was a gift, not a bailout. I told myself I was helping my daughter, but somewhere in the last 2 years, something shifted. Roger stopped asking. He started informing me. He'd show up at the shop, walk the floor like he already owned it, ask my foreman pointed questions about the equipment's resale value. He'd say things to me like, "Walter, you're not getting any younger, you know. Somebody needs to start thinking seriously about succession." He never once said my name with warmth. He said it the way you'd address a landlord you were trying to get something out of. I started to wonder if my son-in-law loved my daughter, or loved the fact that her father happened to own 40 acres and a company worth $11 million. I needed to know the truth before I died, and left this family in his hands by default. So I built a test. It was risky. It might cost me my relationship with my daughter if it went wrong, but I had to know exactly who Roger was when he thought no one important was watching. I invited them out to the house for Sunday dinner, same as always, except this time I didn't shave, and I let my hands shake a little when I poured the wine, and I wore the flannel shirt with the frayed collar that Diane always tried to throw away. I wanted to look like a man whose body had started catching up with him. We sat at the same scarred pine table where Emily used to do her homework. Roger was going on about a boat he was thinking of buying, some center console he'd seen online, and Emily was only half listening, scrolling through something on her phone. I cleared my throat and said I needed to tell them something serious. Roger paused with his fork halfway to his mouth and said, without much interest, "What now, Walter? Another one of the machines break down?" I told them the doctor had found something on my last scan. I told them it was pancreatic, that it had already spread to my liver, that the oncologist in Billings had given me maybe 4 months, maybe less. My voice cracked exactly where I wanted it to crack. Emily's phone hit the table. Her face went white in a way that told me, at least, that her shock was real. But Roger set his fork down slowly, deliberately, and I watched something move behind his eyes that had nothing to do with grief. He asked me, in a voice gone suddenly gentle and careful, whether I'd already spoken to a lawyer about getting things in order. Emily started crying and reached for my hand across the table, and I let her hold it, and my chest ached with real love and real shame at deceiving her. But I watched Roger over her shoulder, and he wasn't comforting his wife. He was doing math. That night I sat alone in my study long after they'd left, staring at Diane's photograph on the shelf, the same one from our 30th anniversary, and I asked her out loud what I'd done wrong raising this family, letting this man into it. I told myself Roger was just bad with emotions, that some men process fear through logistics because feelings are too much for them. I built myself a whole comfortable lie to live inside for a few hours. But the lie didn't survive the morning. I was up before dawn the way I always am, out in my workshop behind the house checking on a batch of custom fixtures I'd been machining for a client in Seattle, and the window was cracked because I like the cold morning air while I work. I heard Roger's voice outside, low and urgent, pacing near the propane tank where the cell signal is strongest. He didn't know I was in there. He was telling someone that the old man's diagnosis changes everything, and that he needed to move fast before Emily's brother-in-law, who's a lawyer, got involved and complicated the estate. My hands went still on the vise. He wasn't talking about grief. He was talking about a timeline. Then he said something that turned my blood to ice water. He said he already had a buyer lined up for the shares. Someone willing to pay $8 million for a controlling interest in the company, cash, quiet, no due diligence headaches. He said once he had power of attorney locked down, on the grounds that the cancer treatment would leave me too impaired to manage my own affairs. He could push the sale through before I even fully understood what I was signing. He said Emily didn't need to know the details, just that Daddy's illness meant Roger finally had to step up and protect the family's assets. I stood frozen against the cold workbench, understanding for the first time that the man my daughter married was planning to use a lie about my death to steal the company I'd built with my own 2 hands. But it was what he said next that nearly buckled my knees. He laughed, this quiet, ugly, satisfied laugh, and said that once the sale closed, he'd already found a nice memory care facility outside Missoula, and that once I was declared incompetent, the timeline just sort of takes care of itself. He said Emily would be sad for a while, but she'd get over it once she saw the money. My daughter. He was talking about locking her father away and using her grief as cover, and he was talking about it like a man discussing a fishing trip. I did not go out there and confront him. I made myself a cup of black coffee with hands that were shaking for real this time, and I sat in my kitchen and let the sorrow curdle slowly into something colder and much more useful. Roger believed he was standing across the chessboard from a dying, confused old man. He had absolutely no idea that I was the silent majority owner of Alders Creek Capital, the very holding group his buyer represented. He was trying to sell my own company back to me. That was the moment the grief in me finally burned all the way down to steel. I thought about my own father, who worked the Anaconda copper mines until his lungs gave out, who never had 2 nickels to leave anybody, who used to tell me that a man's word and a man's work were the only inheritance worth having. I had spent 30 years trying to give Emily something better than that, an easier life, a cushion, a safety net so thick she'd never feel the floor. And somewhere along the way I had built the exact conditions for a man like Roger to walk in and mistake my daughter's comfort for his own entitlement. I spent the whole of that day playing the frightened, failing patient. I let my hands tremble over lunch. I stared blankly out the kitchen window when Roger talked to me, like a man already halfway gone. Emily kept touching my shoulder gently, telling me everything was going to be okay, and it broke something in me every single time, because she believed it. And I was lying to her too, just to save her from him. That evening I drove into town in my old service truck, the one Rogers never bothered to look twice at because it's not worth stealing, and I called my attorney, a woman named Carol Ibsen, who's handled every contract this company has signed for 22 years, and who I trust the way I trusted my own drill sergeant. I told her everything. The overheard call, the fake buyer, the plan to have me declared incompetent. Carol went quiet on the line for a long moment, and when she spoke again her voice had gone hard and flat in a way I'd never heard from her. She asked me what I wanted to do. I told her I wanted to bury him so completely that he never had the chance to hurt my daughter again. I told Carol about Alders Creek Capital, the small private equity fund I'd quietly rolled a chunk of my retirement into 8 years ago, back when a friend from a veterans business group brought me in as a limited partner, specifically because I wanted a stake in the kind of manufacturing and logistics deals that come across a fund's desk long before the public ever hears about them. Nobody in my family knew I had that money working separately from the company, not even Emily. Carol had helped me set it up specifically so it would be invisible to anyone doing a casual background check, because I never wanted my daughter's marriage decisions influenced by the size of my bank account. Now that same invisibility was about to become a weapon. I asked Carol to quietly find out who exactly Roger's buyer was. It took her less than 2 days to confirm what I already suspected, that the offer was being routed through a shell entity that was 3 layers down, wholly owned by Alders Creek. Roger's phantom investor didn't exist. He was trying to sell my company to my own money without knowing it. But there was something worse buried in what Carol found. Roger wasn't doing this out of simple greed. He was doing it out of desperation. Carol's forensic accountant traced a pattern of wire transfers out of Roger's personal accounts over the last 3 years, all going to an online sportsbook registered in Curacao, and then, more recently, to a private lending outfit that Carol's people recognized immediately as a front for a loan shark operation working out of Reno. Roger owed nearly $1.1 million to men who did not send polite reminder letters. He wasn't trying to accelerate an inheritance. He was trying to save his own life. And he had decided my life and my daughter's peace of mind were an acceptable price to pay for it. I sat with that fact for a long time. Then I called Martin Alvarez, a private investigator I'd used years ago during a bitter patent dispute with a competitor. A careful, quiet man who never asked more questions than necessary. I told him to find out everything about the men Roger owed money to, and to find out whether Roger had made any specific promises to them about when the payment was coming. Martin called back 48 hours later and told me, flatly, that the men in Reno had given Roger until the end of the month, and that they had made it very clear what would happen to him personally if that deadline passed. Roger wasn't just risking Emily's inheritance. He'd put himself, and by extension her, directly in the path of people who collect debts with baseball bats instead of lawsuits. That night I sat alone in my study, the same room where I'd built the original business plan for the company on a yellow legal pad 30 years ago, and I let myself feel it, all of it. The grief for the boy Roger must have once been before gambling hollowed him out, the fury at what he was willing to do to my daughter to save himself, the crushing guilt that I had made his greed possible by never once making Emily or her husband earn a single dollar of the comfort I'd handed them. I did not sleep. When the sun came up over the Bridgers, I had made my decision. I was done being a victim in this story. It was time to become the author of it. I called Carol first thing in the morning and told her to structure a deal. Through Alders Creek, I would quietly acquire Roger's entire debt from the Reno lenders directly, paying full value plus a premium in exchange for a clean, discreet, immediate transfer of the note. Carol pushed back once, gently, telling me these were dangerous people to bring into direct contact with, even at a financial distance. I told her I understood the risk, and I wanted it done anyway. Men like that care about one thing only, getting their money without complications, and a guaranteed, no-hassle payout from an anonymous buyer was going to be more attractive to them than the uncertain, messy business of squeezing a broke insurance salesman in Montana. Carol had the transfer completed within 4 days. Roger's debt, every dollar of it, now belonged quietly to a fund that I controlled completely. The men who had been threatening to break his kneecaps had already been paid off and had already moved on to their next target, utterly indifferent to who now owned Roger's paper. Roger, of course, had no idea any of this had happened. He believed his deadline was still ticking down toward violence. Meanwhile, I kept playing my part. I let Roger walk me through the fabricated purchase agreement for the shares, a stack of documents he'd had drawn up by some strip mall lawyer he'd found, who clearly hadn't asked a single hard question about where the buyer's money was actually coming from. He'd sit across from me at my own kitchen table, tapping his finger on the signature line, telling me gently, patiently, the way you'd talk to a frightened child, that this was the responsible thing to do, that it would take the burden off Emily, that I should trust him to handle everything from here. Emily hovered nearby during these conversations, refilling my water glass, watching me with an expression of such raw, helpless love that some nights I had to excuse myself to the bathroom just to keep from breaking down in front of both of them. I let 3 more days pass exactly like that. I let Roger believe the fake buyer was closing. I let him believe his debt in Reno was still a ticking bomb that only this sale could defuse. I let him believe he had outmaneuvered a dying, foolish old man. And every single night, after they left, I sat with Carol and Martin on a conference call, tightening the final pieces, until finally, on a gray Thursday morning with frost still on the windshield of my truck, Roger called to say the closing was set for that Saturday, right there at my house, with the buyer's representative and a notary both coming to me so I wouldn't have to be stressed by travel. Saturday morning came in cold and bright over the mountains. I sat at the head of my own kitchen table, the same table Diane and I bought secondhand the year we got married, and I let my shoulders sag the way they'd been sagging for weeks. Roger arrived first, in a suit that fit a little too tight across the shoulders, practically vibrating with barely contained relief. Emily came in behind him, quiet, red-eyed, having clearly spent the last several nights crying over a father she believed was dying. Behind them came two men I'd never met, a nervous-looking notary clutching a leather folder, and a heavy-set man in a dark canvas jacket who Roger introduced only as the buyer's associate, a man whose flat, watchful eyes told me instantly he wasn't from any private equity fund. He was muscle-sent to make sure the paperwork went through clean. Roger spread the documents across my table, right over the same wood grain where Emily used to do her algebra homework, and pointed to the yellow tabs marking every place I needed to sign. He put a pen in my hand, a cheap ballpoint, not even the courtesy of a good pen, and told me gently that everything was going to be fine, that he was handling everything now, that all I had to do was sign. I let the pen shake in my grip. I let the silence stretch out long enough that even the notary looked uncomfortable. And then I set the pen down. I looked up at Roger and told him that the pancreatic cancer diagnosis he'd been planning around for 6 weeks did not exist, that my last scan had come back completely clear, and that I had known exactly what he was doing since the morning I heard him on the phone outside my workshop window. The color drained out of his face so fast I thought he might actually faint into the eggs Emily had made him for breakfast. Emily made a small, strangled sound and looked back and forth between us, uncomprehending. I told Roger that I was the majority owner of Alders Creek Capital, the fund standing behind his mystery buyer, and that he had spent 6 weeks trying to sell my company back to my own money. I told him that I also now personally owned every dollar of the $1.1 million he owed to the men in Reno, and that the debt collectors he'd been terrified of for months had already been paid off and had already forgotten his name because I was his creditor now, and I intended to be far less patient than they ever were. The man in the canvas jacket straightened up fast, understanding before Roger did that the deal had just collapsed underneath him, and reached for the door, clearly done with whatever this had turned into. The notary started gathering his papers with shaking hands, mumbling that he hadn't known anything about any of this, which I believe was true. Roger just stood there, his mouth working soundlessly, looking, for the first time since I'd known him, genuinely afraid. I told him he had 2 choices. The first was that I could call the Gallatin County Sheriff's Department right now and report attempted fraud, elder financial exploitation, and conspiracy, all of which Carol had already documented in exhaustive, airtight detail, complete with the forensic trail of his gambling debts and recorded testimony from the fake buyer's actual representative, a man Martin had quietly turned 3 days earlier by offering him full immunity from the fraud charge in exchange for cooperation. The second choice was that Roger could sign, right there, an agreement Carol had drawn up the night before, one that immediately and irrevocably transferred all his interest in Emily's inheritance to a trust that would benefit only her and any future children, that put him under a legally binding repayment schedule for the debt I now owned, and that required him to move out of the house within 30 days. Emily was crying, but she wasn't defending him. She was staring at her husband with the particular, devastating clarity of a woman, finally seeing something she'd been refusing to look at directly for years. She asked him, in a voice gone very small, whether any of it was true, the gambling, the debt, the plan to have her father declared incompetent. Roger didn't answer her. He looked at the documents, he looked at me, and he signed. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected, and harder in a different way than the confrontation itself had been. Emily moved back into her old room for a while, working through what it meant to have built 6 years of her life around a man who had been willing to trade her father's freedom for a bookmaker's deadline. I didn't say much during that time. I just made coffee every morning and let her talk when she wanted to and sat with her in silence when she didn't. Carol finalized the divorce paperwork alongside the trust restructuring, and Roger, stripped of any claim to the marital assets and legally on the hook to me for over $1 million, took a job managing a tire shop in Idaho Falls, as far from Bozeman as his pride could carry him. I used part of what would have been Roger's stolen fortune to set up something new instead, a small foundation in Diane's name that provides free legal consultations to elderly people in Montana who suspect a family member is trying to manipulate them out of their assets. We've helped 41 families in the first year alone. I still run the company. My hands are steady. My mind is sharp. I go into the shop most mornings before the sun's fully up, same as I always have, and some evenings I sit out on the porch with Emily, who's slowly rebuilding a life that's entirely her own for the first time since college, and we don't talk about Roger much anymore. I think about my father sometimes, out there in those mines, telling me a man's word was worth more than anything he could hand down. I spent my whole life trying to give my daughter more than he ever gave me, and somewhere in all that giving, I nearly handed a predator the keys to everything I'd built. Love isn't supposed to be blind. The people who deserve your trust will still deserve it after you stop paying for it, and the ones who don't will show you exactly who they are the moment they think there's nothing left to gain from pretending otherwise. I found out who my son-in-law really was before it cost me everything, and I'll carry that particular hard-won relief for whatever years I've got left. If you've ever had to see through someone in your own family before it was too late, I'd like to hear about it, because I don't think I'm the only father who's had to learn this lesson the hard way.